Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility, with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
There's a whole generation of adults out there who were raised with the expectation that we would already have long ago created these capabilities in flight.
We'll look back to today and say, how in the world did we not see XYZ come? I think commercial drones will become a common tool in the enterprise toolbox. And in many markets, I think it'll be almost impossible to consider the old ways of doing business without this ability to access the third dimension.
So here we are, our first podcast. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jim Barry, and along with Peter Shannon and Luka Tomjanovic, we're going to talk about the business of the vertical space and discuss how drones, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, electric aircraft, and all elements within advanced air mobility deliver value or plan to deliver value to their customers and to their investors. We're going to discuss why we started the podcast, why we think the topic is important for so many, a little bit about ourselves, so you know who's behind the podcast, and we'll talk about the upcoming topics and speakers who will be joining our show. We believe you, our listeners, will want to understand more about all aspects of advanced air mobility and why it's important, relevant, exciting, and even fun. Thanks for joining us.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
So let me introduce our team. Peter Shannon is the founder of Radius Capital, focused on the advanced air mobility and its application toward positive impact for transportation across the economy. He is active in the aviation community around issues critical to enabling high-scale adoption of aerial mobility systems, serving in various capacities alongside NASA and through the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. He has been in venture capital since 2005, working at Firelight Capital and Atlas Venture, while investing in transportation and sustainability technologies. Peter holds an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth and a BS in systems engineering from the University of Virginia. He started flying when he was 19 and holds an instrument rating. Luka Tomjanovic began his career as a fighter pilot, flying MiGs for the Croatian Air Force. Since he left the military 10 years ago, Luka built a career in finance, corporate development, and venture capital in both aerospace and automotive industries. Before joining Radius Capital as a partner, Luka was a partner at Airbus Ventures, leading investments in technologies shaping the future of aerospace. He is an aeronautical engineering graduate from the United States Air Force Academy and holds an MBA from the University of Notre Dame. I'm CEO of Celerity 05, a management consulting firm that drives growth and returns on investment for tech companies, tech buyers, and tech investors within the transportation, logistics, and mobility markets. Previously as CEO of an aviation technology company, Vice President of Technology and Marketing for a leading healthcare technology company, and a United States Marine, I have delivered value by focusing on the importance of innovation and transformation. I have a degree in economics from Rhode Island College and an MBA from the University of New Haven. And where I gain the most energy is in solving problems and driving change in areas where most people thought impossible. That's why I love the focus of this podcast. So let me introduce my podcast partners, Peter Shannon and Luka Tomjanovic. Peter and Luka, welcome.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, Jim.
So guys, I put together a couple of questions that we could all answer. And I'm going to start with, hey, we just heard your bio. What would somebody who has known you for, let's say, 20 years say about you? And what's a topic that few of your peers agree with you on?
Well, Jim, I suppose that the people who have known me for that long would look back and say, well, Peter, at least you've been consistent. I was an airplane and computer kid when I was 6, 7 years old, and here we are 40 years later, and I'm still doing the same thing. I would say the same thing at 20 years ago as well. I have really kind of found myself in this field, having been in venture since 2005, really drawing upon every past interest professionally in my life, a lot of the experiences and skills that I've been taught, and in some strange twist of fortune, those have all converged and are all contributing to what we're doing here in the advanced air mobility space. And I certainly didn't plan it this way, but looking back, it all seems to kind of make sense.
What do most people or some people disagree with you on?
Well, I think there are a lot of things within advanced air mobility that we could say that we disagree upon, because we're all trying to look into the fog of the future and see what it looks like. I think one of the differences that kind of captures a lot of those different discussions that we've had over drinks with different people in the industry is that many of us in this industry look at the future and take a prescriptive sort of approach to it. And they say that, we're going to create these technologies, and then with them, obviously, we're going to go and create XYZ service using them. And that is how the world is going to embrace this technology. I quite frankly take a much more humble approach to it. I think that we don't really know how people are going to embrace advanced air mobility. Essentially, this new capability to access vertical space. That's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is such a fundamentally new capability that where it crops up and where it finds its killer applications, I think that's out there in the minds and the imaginations of entrepreneurs in different industries across the whole economy. I look forward to learning from them, to seeing us as a community bring forward products that put that capability in their hands, and then let them play with it and morph it and apply it and not be so prescriptive. And out of that, we're going to see an explosion of applications, and we're going to see this technology manifest in ways that we really aren't talking enough about today. So I'd say that's where the biggest difference in point of view, I think, comes from.
Luca, what would people, somebody who knows you for 20 years, say about you? And what's a topic that few of your peers agree with you on?
Here, Jim, I think you'll have to find those people and ask them yourself. I don't really like to talk about myself, and I don't think the audience really cares that much either. But on your second question, I do, to Peter's point, this is still a nascent field at many levels. So there are quite a few things that diverge, I guess, from industry consensus. Perhaps one that's worth highlighting is the topic of autonomy in the context of commercial airliners. I think we as an industry are jumping too quickly to the conclusion that removing the pilot from the cockpit will result in the kinds of safety and cost benefits that the industry is broadcasting currently. I often hear a version of the narrative that goes something like, human error, contributes to roughly 80% of the accidents. So just remove the pilot and problem solved. And I think that's a very narrow way of looking at the flight environment. Humans will, I think, always need to be somewhere in the vicinity of the command and control loop, whether it's in, on, or around. So by removing the pilot, you're just simply moving where this human error originates from. And oh, by the way, you're exposing, new risks altogether. So of course, I'm wholeheartedly in favor of increasing automation. This is a trend as old as aviation itself, and it will continue unabated. And many interesting technologies have matured in recent years that will support this continued evolution. But, my point is that I encourage a more system-wide aperture instead of narrow technology-centric view when it comes to autonomy.
Very cool, Luca. What motivated the team to create the podcast?
Well, there's a lot of good content out there, from webinars to blogs and newsletters and podcasts and such. What we wanted to do is to talk about all of the important market drivers, from technology and regulation and capital, public acceptance, and all the others. But importantly, to always maintain a pragmatic perspective when we discuss these trends and drivers. And throughout the podcast series, we will often put entrepreneurial hats on and try to translate these market drivers to what's really actionable and practical from the perspective of building a business in this market. Part of the reason is that we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs coming into the advanced air mobility space from other industries not related to aviation or aerospace. And they do so because they're recognizing the potential to make a difference and to generate significant value. But they're generally unaware of the, call it, written and unwritten rules of the industry. So I think one of my primary motivations is to bring this world closer to that group in the way that makes sense to them.
Great, Luca. Peter?
I mean, I would say that this podcast is really important and going to be really interesting because there's a whole generation of adults out there who were raised with the expectation that we would already have long ago created these capabilities in flight. And to illustrate the point, think about the amount of change in the outside world, in cities and transportation systems that our great-grandparents' generation witnessed. There's a story of an Apollo astronaut named Tom Stafford. His mother came to Oklahoma in the late 1890s in a covered wagon. And she was young at that time, she lived to see her son be launched on a Saturn V rocket to the moon. And in between, she witnessed the invention of the airplane, the creation of the automobile as a consumer product, electrification of cities and rural areas across the entire country, all of these technological advances that transformed the landscape, that changed what the world looked like every time you walked out your front door. And then contrast that to my lifetime. I was born in 1974. In 1974, the airports looked kind of like they do today. I mean, today they're bigger. They haven't fundamentally changed in their shape and function. Ditto with the cities and the highways and the cars. In my lifetime, we've seen these massive advances in the invisible things, in medicine and materials, obviously in software and information. And those have had a transformative effect. But I think all of us have been expecting to see more in terms of these things that we were raised to expect in terms of aerospace and transportation and how we would be, moving around in flying cars and the like. And now, finally, we're at the cusp of seeing that stuff actually happen because a whole series of technologies have been maturing over the last 50 years that are giving us a shot at doing that. And this podcast is talking about how that might come together and what we're going to see, how to make sense of what we're seeing right now, and with a clear-eyed set of expectations, start to think about what we can reasonably see commercializing in the coming years. So that's what gets me excited about talking about this stuff.
For the time that I've spent on advanced air mobility, I have been amazed by the confusion and the misinformation and the misunderstanding about the market. And so the idea that we can provide some clarity, talking to good, competent people across the spectrum, I think it's so important. What's the importance of the podcast and what's the importance of the advanced air mobility? What difference will it make near or long term?
The podcast helps us build a frame and give people a sense of background and context to make sense of all of the headlines that we're seeing, especially if you pay attention to the aerospace industry, press, and the advanced air mobility community. There's just a deluge of announcements, of financings, of technology demonstrations and partnerships going on right now. And it's hard to put all of those in context unless we first start to think about sort of the why now type question and drivers that are really behind it. I think that with advanced air mobility itself, the topic of the podcast, this is a really formative time. This is perhaps the most dynamic period of time in the aviation industry since maybe the 1930s in terms of the new concepts that are being tried, the things that are being flown, the new types of business ideas that are being funded. It really is a huge influx of engineering talent and of investors into the aviation industry that I don't think we've seen since the excitement that was generated by Charles Lindbergh's 1927 crossing of the Atlantic, which saw a similar wave of vision and ideas and entrepreneurs coming into aviation. So we're at this point, And what we're doing is we are integrating technologies that are giving us new capabilities in flight, simplifying how we access vertical space above us, whether we're using electric propulsion to create vertical flight air vehicles or whether we're trying to create autonomous aircraft. All of these are ingredients towards a new set of flight platforms that people are developing that might be as small as a drone that you could hold in your hand, or might be, a 10 or 20 person aircraft, and everything in between. And all of these types of vehicles are being designed, they're being tested. We're converging on which different vehicle designs are best for the different types of missions to be flown. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's a toss-up right now in terms of all the new ways that this technology can be employed. And people are exploring a whole list of new types of flight missions that really are powered by this technology. So it's a very dynamic time and very exciting to follow it, to try and sort it out and make sense of it is, some of the things that we'll be having a unique opportunity to delve into in this series of podcast discussions.
Thanks, Peter. Luca, who's the audience for the podcast? How does it differ, in your opinion, from other sessions or webinars on advanced air mobility?
It's primarily innovators and entrepreneurs that are looking at the advanced air mobility market, that might be thinking about how to get involved, where it makes sense to start a business, how to think about structuring partnerships, and in that way add some clarity to their thought process. At the same time, though, I do hope that the podcast will be interesting to those that are already in the industry, to the investors that perhaps want to learn more about the market and the opportunities within that space, and broadly the general public, whose ultimately lives will be impacted in the coming years and decades by this market.
It's amazing, the audience, that frankly, as I've told people about the podcast, the number of people who are interested and the diverse nature of the people and people who've traditionally been in aviation, users of aviation. I think it's going to be very exciting. What is advanced air mobility anyway? Is it just electric aircraft? Peter, I've talked to people who've been in this business for a while, and there's still confusion about what's the definition of it.
Yeah, this is something that we struggled with a few years ago, as we were starting to see all of these different headlines from the drone community and from these larger electric aircraft that were being tested that would become urban air taxis and the like. Advanced air mobility is really the intersection of new technologies with flight and the new capabilities that those technologies bestow upon flight. Some of these might be electric propulsion. Other aspects might be software, data, and increasing automation applied to flight, even to the point of full autonomy for flight. And then another contributing technology to this is this notion of networked connectivity between air vehicles and infrastructure, and the systems and data that stitch these newly capable air vehicles together into high density complex networks that can be purposed towards package logistics or cargo or moving passengers or some other mission that is solving a given need in an industry. We think of advanced air mobility as really this fundamental new capability to access vertical space. The things that when you combine electric propulsion with aircraft design and advanced software with flight control systems and autonomous flight, we start to overcome a lot of the obstacles that we faced 50 and 60 years ago during the 20th century when we were trying to create these same types of capabilities in flight. In the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of money was spent researching vertical flight, researching tilt-wing aircraft, researching short takeoff and landing aircraft. And while we learned a tremendous amount during that period of time, and we flew a lot of different types of technology demonstrators and prototypes, ultimately, a lot of those designs didn't make it into production because they were either too complex, or they were too expensive to operate, or they didn't quite fulfill the needs of the mission that the design was intended to explore. Now, with these new technologies, with distributed electric propulsion, reducing the overall cost and complexity of creating an air vehicle that has a lot of different propulsors on it and that is able to transform itself from a vertical flight mode into a horizontal flight mode. And with the fly-by-wire and software-driven control systems that manage all of those control surfaces and all of that complexity for the pilot, we have the technological basis to revisit a lot of these missions and to revisit a lot of these aircraft designs to bring them to market and to explore their application for a whole set of new different types of missions.
Yeah, it's a much broader category of definition than most people would think. I think if you asked a lot of people today about advanced air mobility, they would probably say it has something to do with vertical takeoff electric aircraft. And yet the definition that you've talked, yeah, it is true, correct. But it's so much broader. It is something that I think hopefully another purpose of the podcast will be to educate people on what really is advanced air mobility and what's its impact going to be.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the vertical electric flight type aircraft are one very visible example, one that has gotten a lot of public attention, but it's by no means the only thing that is going on in this space. There's a lot of work being done around fixed wing aircraft, around short takeoff and landing aircraft, around very small aircraft that could carry a 5 or 20 pound payload. And it's a very diverse field of technology application right now, which is part of what makes it so exciting.
Luca, what do we learn about the topic that you think the audience will immediately find interesting?
Continuing along the same lines that we just discussed, I think most people, when they hear about advanced air mobility, they immediately imagine the Jetsons like flying cars buzzing above cities, not unlike what we've seen in movies like Blade Runner or The Fifth Element. And while that is a very interesting use case, it's also the most complex use case, and it will not really meaningfully materialize in this decade. However, beyond these headline-grabbing use cases and examples, there's an entire set of missions and use cases across the economy that exist today, that are relevant today, that are delivering value today, measurable value to enterprise customers worldwide. And I think our listeners will enjoy learning more about that aspect of advanced air mobility as well, and hearing from some of the operators and users and hearing from their experience.
Peter, how does advanced air mobility fit into the overall transportation ecosystem? You've done some great work in this area.
Well, it's really a very differentiated mode of transportation versus road transportation or rail transportation. These other modes of transportation upon which most of modern society runs. And the difference is that once you get into the air, you can go directly to your destination, irrespective of road infrastructure that is built out for you, irrespective of the terrain or bodies of water that lie between you and your destination. It really is a very infrastructure light mode of transportation, if you think about it that way. Really all that we need to field in terms of infrastructure for advanced air mobility are the points of departure and arrival and the software systems, the software infrastructure that manages the routing and the traffic in the air. That plus the air vehicles, and you have a transportation system that is in place. And this type of a transportation system is really very different and very complementary to existing ground-based transportation that is dependent upon all of that path infrastructure. It may be thin in capacity, air mobility, but it's rapid and it's very flexible in terms of where the traffic flows are at different times. And if those traffic flows change over time between the different destinations served, an air mobility system can accommodate that very, very gracefully in a way that changing traffic flows in a large city area with ground transportation can cause a lot of congestion issues and infrastructure strain. That doesn't happen in the air.
Luca, what parts of advanced air mobility will we be shining a light on that you think need emphasis or are underreported today?
That's a good question. I really hope that in the discussions that we'll have with our podcast speakers, that we are successful in maintaining a system-wide perspective to things and to really understand the drivers and dimensions by which this new era of aviation innovation will evolve. Technology revolutions almost never come in discrete steps. I think history teaches us that an ecosystem must develop first. If we, for example, the invention of the steam engine didn't really create a monumental impact until only after the railroad and the telegraph were also invented. So it's as much about the technology as it is about how you use it. It really dictates how successful an industry evolves. So I really hope to emphasize this ecosystem throughout our discussions. What are the railroads and telegraph equivalents that need to develop and mature in order to realize the vision of advanced air mobility? I think that's worth highlighting and emphasizing.
It's funny, Luke, and you and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. A lot of money was invested into next-gen, kind of the next-gen improvement program from the FAA. People were talking about, what are we really trying to achieve? After so much money has been spent, what are we really trying to achieve? So I approached a transportation leader and I said, if you could focus on one thing that would most be improved as a result of billions of dollars being invested in next-gen, what would you want to improve? They said, if it came down to one thing, how do we reduce the flight time?
Right.
Or the block time of the aircraft?
I was recently at a conference, a virtual conference, and I heard people discuss the modernization of air traffic systems and flows. And there was a figure that was floated around that said that just improving the flow and optimized climbs, optimized cruise levels, continuous descents, all of those small, relatively low-hanging fruit improvements might ultimately result in low double-digit improvements in emissions, decarbonization. But it's interesting that even with these kinds of solutions that don't require technological development and years in certification and commercialization of these technologies, that is proving very difficult because of the high inertia built into the system, the relatively old infrastructure and equipment that is used, and also the fact that you have to convince entire sets of countries to go and modernize this, because we're talking about a global system that needs to be implemented globally in order to work. Back to this ecosystem of, it's not just a technology that can optimize the route and tell you exactly where you need to go based on wind and all of these other factors, but you really need to understand the environment that you're going into and the forces that are behind it and driving it and shaping it.
And keep in mind from the very beginning, what are the goals we're trying to achieve, and what are the metrics we'll put in place to achieve those objectives? For us to be able to shine a light on that and get people's perspectives on that, I think that's a great contribution I think we can make to the industry. What technologies or manufacturing processes are associated with advanced air mobility?
We'll talk about all the major technology enablers. We will have speakers discussing electrification of vehicles. We'll talk about novel propulsion systems and specifically how they fit to the different use cases that are imagined by the different kinds of vehicles. Certainly the increasingly automated vehicles and traffic management systems, the technologies that are underpinning the connectedness and the networked nature of this system of systems that we call air mobility. But then also we'll look beyond the technologies and explore what the opportunities are, to your point, in manufacturing, again, from a very much entrepreneurial vantage point. How do you use additive manufacturing or digital twins, digital threads, some of those digital engineering technologies? Lastly, physical and digital infrastructure needs. That's a lot to cover, but we'll certainly try to get folks to share their perspectives in a way that is, again, pragmatic and practical, and people can take away from it and hopefully implement in their own businesses.
Additionally, I think we'll see a lot of people bringing attention to propulsion system challenges. And this is both the energy storage that is brought along on board the vehicle, the battery or the fuel source, as well as how you manage that energy to the propulsors themselves and the performance of the propulsion technologies. And I think there will be a lot of attention given both to the sustainability aspects of these systems, the performance and range and safety margin that they bring to the air vehicle itself, and then also other environmental impacts, such as how we can maintain as low a noise signature as possible, and create air vehicles that really fit into the communities in which they aim to be operating. I also think that we'll see a lot of attention devoted towards how increasing automation allows us to safely increase the density of air vehicles that are operating in a given region. Of course, today's airspace system that is driven by highly trained professionals in the cockpit and highly trained professionals in the air traffic control centers, it operates at really relatively low vehicle density. When you think about the spacing of vehicles in our airspace system and compare that to the spacing of human-operated vehicles in ground transportation, there's a huge difference today. And I think that there's a lot of attention being given in circles now within the air mobility community as to what are the tenable stepping stones that get us from the system we operate into today up to higher levels of density, while still accommodating the human pilots that are in the system, operating alongside the more automated aircraft. I think that's going to be an interesting area of discussion in this series as well.
Peter, on the topic of improving outcomes, which you were just discussing, what do you say to the naysayers? What do you say to the people who feel it's a technology in search of an outcome?
In terms of it being a technology searching for an application, I think that if we look at the history of transportation technologies, and you can go really far back with this, but if we look at the history of transportation, we find that every time a transportation capability is given to society, society finds productive ways to make use of it. And in fact, they saturate that capacity and then continue to demand more. I think that these are fundamental new capabilities that we're fielding, and I acknowledge that we don't know the full extent to exactly how they're going to be used. But I think if history is a guide, we're going to see that people are going to employ them in a whole spectrum of productive ways. So I have a lot of comfort around that aspect of the question. I think that the naysayers around advanced air mobility are very important voices for the community to have in the conversation, because there are a lot of system-wide type hurdles to fielding these new types of aircraft and the missions that they're going to fly. There's a lot of complexity involved with this. And the people who see where the bottlenecks are, or who have the experience in their backgrounds that point to how some aspects of this are going to take a lot longer than the visionaries think, or how the integration of the new supply chain is going to be more complex. Those are very, very valuable viewpoints, and those are important things to have as part of the conversation. So I really like to hear from the naysayers. I think that they bring, in many cases, they bring some of the most important insights that help us stay on top of all of the different disciplines that are coming together in this space.
And I'd like to echo that, just say that we will try to have some controversial topics and speakers and hear from a variety of voices. And it's true across all disciplines and life in general. If we really seek to understand the truth, we need diversity of thought. We need to take different, sometimes opposing perspectives and engage in a healthy, controversial, if need be, discussions with enthusiasts and skeptics alike.
I think anybody wants to repeat the mistakes of the past. The things that were learned in aeronautics in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, when we were pioneering rotorcraft, when we were exploring tilt rotor and tilt wing aircraft, when all of that work was being done, the things learned there are equally applicable today. The laws of physics and aerodynamics and thermodynamics have not changed. The tools that we are reapproaching these challenges with today, they're different, but we still have a tremendous amount of prior gained knowledge and insight in terms of these aircraft that was done, and it's written down and it's available. And many of those people are still in the community to approach and learn from.
If we polled our audiences 5 years from now, what would you want them to say about the podcast?
I think the podcast would be a success if people said that it helped create a frame for their interpretation of this rapid stream of innovations and announcements that are going on right now. And that if this frame helped them make sense, put in sort of a bigger picture of context where those things sit, and to more clearly set their expectations for what we might see in the coming years as a result of this technology, then I think that the podcast and that the people that we bring into these conversations through this series of podcasts, I think it's all a success at that point if we can just clear that bar.
I think about that same question myself. I think if we shined a light on the use cases and companies and processes that are really working, providing a strong return to their companies while respecting and being realistic about their certification process, for example, and the requirements of working within the airspace, I think that also would be a great result of the podcast. So guys, as we know in the podcast, we're going to ask some regular standard questions of all of our speakers. So why don't we ask ourselves some of those questions? So Peter, what's the most common misconception or misunderstanding on the topic?
I think it's that we are going to go from fielding these version 1.0 vehicle technologies and go immediately into the very demanding, very high scale use cases of the technology, such as the public facing air taxi or the very high density drone delivery networks that are going to be immediately scaled up. I think that there is a conception that that's how this is going to play out and that we build it and then we scale it rapidly. I think in reality, we're going to see many stepping stones that get us there, but that those stepping stones are in themselves incredibly lucrative market opportunities for the businesses going after them. And they might be using these technologies in less densely populated areas. They might be using them for public service or defense or industrial or limited commercial applications. They might be used in a bunch of industry or against a bunch of business problems that we aren't talking about a lot today. But in reality, those are the applications that are compatible with the first versions of the technology. Those are the applications where we're going to build the critical operating experience that allows us to move on to the second generation of these air vehicles and allows us to have the operating experience and all of the supporting systems and the cultural DNA in these organizations, both manufacturers and operators, to then be able to go and take it to this next level, which is the $1 trillion market, world-changing type of transportation systems that people envision.
Luke, if you fast forward 5 to 10 years, what does the industry look like?
Let me dust off my crystal ball real quick. I think in the 5-year time frame, the regulatory framework will be considerably more defined, specifically for commercial drones, and they will be used in complex operations on a routine basis. And that will be such an incredible boost to enterprise productivity and just overall value to consumers, because today we don't have this regulatory clarity to the extent that we would want to. It's almost like owning a car, but being able to only drive it around the parking lot. Or if you want to take it out for a spin around the neighborhood, you can do that provided that you have a safety observer at every intersection. That's how, almost, I'm exaggerating, but this is almost what it feels like today. If you have a high performance UAS system, a drone, but it really is difficult to be able to take that bird and really fly and deliver value in a cost effective way. So I think there's a lot of good and ongoing work on developing standards and regulations. And so I think in 5 years, this regulatory landscape will have a lot more clarity, which will in turn provide further incentive for innovators and capital to flow into the sector. I think we'll also see maturation of the supply base and the value chains as vertical integration that exists today will start to evolve into a more horizontal and rich value chain of enabling technologies and services. And I think also in that time frame, we'll have a first couple of eVTOLs that will be conducting some early commercial operations at limited scale, at very well-defined routes, And we'll also have beginnings in a few certified electric general aviation aircraft that will start to signal this renaissance and reinvigoration of the general aviation market. On the military side, here in the US, at least, I think 5 years from now, I think we'll be in more or less of a catch-up mode, ramping up acquisitions of unmanned aircraft systems for various missions from intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting, communications, and the increasingly tense geopolitical environment, I think, will only provide further tailwinds to this trend. And then sometime between 5 and 10-year mark, I think, as complex drone operations become routine, I think it's inevitable that we'll expose certain weaknesses in operations and technologies. We'll see people complaining about noise pollution. We'll discover new challenges altogether. I think this is not unlike the ramp up of any new industry and market. And as a result, much like we've seen in the early days of aviation, there will be an increasing emphasis on improving the robustness and reliability and safety of the enabling technologies and services that are supporting these operations. So I think that's sort of in the near term. 10 years from now, we'll look back to today and say, how in the world did we not see XYZ coming?
Right.
I think commercial drones will become a common tool in the enterprise toolbox. And in many markets, I think it'll be almost impossible to consider the old ways of doing business without this ability to access the third dimension. And from this ramp up in adoption, we'll discover altogether new use cases and services built on top of these platforms. As Peter mentioned, I think there's a lot that we will learn by doing. It's hard to imagine today and point a finger at it, but at least that's the trend that I feel pretty strong conviction around.
So, Peter, another question we'll ask each of our guests is, what outcomes will most be improved as a result of this topic?
Well, I think if we take advanced air mobility broadly and we combine the advancements that we see in small drones carrying a thing, cargo or delivery, and we also include the passenger transportation side of it, I think when we sum it up and we look further out into the future, here we are at a point in time where we're taking technologies that have matured past certain thresholds, where now they're good enough to be combined together into these flying systems. We have energy systems that bring enough energy along. We have propulsion systems that can enable the vehicle to fly. We have navigation and communication systems that enable them to maneuver successfully to their destination. And right now, we're working on combining these new technologies, understanding the possibilities that each of them bring to the equation, and creating new air vehicles that exploit these capabilities. Once we do that, and once we have proven it out and demonstrated the operation, then I think we're going to see a period of rapid scaling, and we're going to see an explosion of applications of this same technology by people who may not be immersed in the middle of the aerospace industry, but they have seen delivery drones, for example, be matured and simplified to the point where they can embrace them for their business. And in so doing, they are effectively bringing a logistics capability into their business that they never had in-house before. They always depended upon Amazon or FedEx or the US Postal Service or some outside group to provide logistics to enable them to physically reach their customers. And now they'll have that opportunity to bring that within their control and to customize it, to change their business and change their competitive stance on the back of that new capability. And more broadly, I think that advanced air mobility, whether moving a thing or moving a person, it isn't about reducing the time that it takes to make the trips that we're making today. Instead, it's about the possibility of making a whole new set of trip, possibility of not having to make a trip anymore. I don't have to get in my car and go to the store to pick up my prescription or to pick up food or some item and bring it home. There now is actually a viable delivery service that can bring it to me in the time frame that I need from when I want to order it. So for the things that I want in 30 minutes or in 15 minutes, suddenly there's a new capability to deliver that, and I don't have to take that trip. Or in the case of passenger movements, it's not about how long is my commute today, but perhaps it's about, with this new air transportation option, changing where I think about where I spend my time. Where do I choose to live? Where do I choose to work? How do I think about the time and space around me in light of this new transportation technology? And I think if we apply that lens back through history, we'll see that the railroad, in a way, changed our perception of the time and space around us. The automobile did it again. Commercial air transport did it again. And each of them had a different type of effect on us in terms of the frequency in which we could use them, in terms of the number of destinations that each of them served. And this whole area of advanced air mobility is going to have that impact on our lives. In some cases, it's going to be within 5 years. In other cases, it's going to take a lot longer. But in each instance, it is going to be this moment of bending time and space in a way, and allowing us to think about location in a very new way. And that shift in thinking translates to a huge shift in asset value when we think about the value of location. When we look really far ahead in this, we're in the trenches right now, trying to explore the possibilities of and to perfect a new set of capabilities in accessing vertical space in air transportation. But as we get through that gate, and as these vehicles and the types of missions that they can perform solidify and are proven out and begin to scale, we're going to see them applied in many, many different ways. And then in broader society, we're going to see this other effect start to ripple through. And it's going to be a very interesting period of time to watch.
So if you had 1 minute to summarize the podcast and its value for a listener, what would you say?
What we commit to is to bring interesting speakers and engage in important discussions about various dimensions of advanced air mobility, always maintaining a system-wide and pragmatic lens. And so whether you're an entrepreneur, an existing operator in the industry, an investor, or just an ordinary citizen interested in how this market will impact your daily routine, I'd say stick around. It'll be exciting.
Thanks, Peter and Luca, and thanks to our listeners. If you have suggestions for topics and speakers, or just want to give suggestions for improvement, we'll make it easy to let us know. Until then, enjoy our conversations with our upcoming guests around this important and exciting topic.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.